Hi guys, my name's Andrew and today I'm driving an Alfa Romeo Giulia. Even 8 years after its original launch, the Giulia is still a stunning car and holds up incredibly well to the competition. Though to be fair, it really should, because prior to this, Alfa Romeo hasn't sold a car in the US since 1995, the last one being the 164 sedan, and their reputation at the time was not the greatest. But this new Giulia is also not the first Giulia, of course reviving a nameplate from the Italian brand in the 1960s and 70s. Much like Alfa Romeos of the past, this Giulia has clearly been designed from the top down. Interestingly, the first model unveiled in 2015 was the high-performance quadrifoglio version, which normally happens the other way around. Normally brands show off the entry-level car first and then do a performance version later. But this thing clearly has been designed with performance paramount and driving experience. Almost to a fault, actually, but we'll talk more about that later. Hopping into this more entry-level Giulia TI Sport, obviously there are a few things missing from the quadrifoglio, namely the Ferrari-derived twin-turbo V6, but tons of the QV's other great characteristics remain present in this car. The 8-speed automatic transmission is perfectly snappy in dynamic mode, and honestly, the 4-cylinder doesn't sound terrible. There's no fake noise in here, which I really appreciate, and while it doesn't quite have the power or the bark of the V6, it is one of the quickest in the segment, actually, at a 0 to 60 of just around 5 seconds. It's also one of the more powerful options in the segment, reasonably, at 280 horsepower and 306 foot-pounds of torque. What you get instead of the QV, though, is a car that's arguably better rounded, because the chassis dynamics, which favor the rear end, of course, are still here. They're still great. The steering is a little light, but honestly, it's not overdone, overboosted like a lot of the modern BMW products, so I think that's actually okay. And it really feels great from behind the wheel in pretty much every regard. Speaking of steering, actually, these aluminum steering column mounted paddle shifters are phenomenal, and honestly make getting the TI Sport package worth it on its own. Of course, you do also get an electronic limited slip differential and a couple of other things, but, you know, these paddle shifters, there's no other 4-cylinder car I've driven recently, I don't think, with paddles as good as these, and make up for the fact that there's no manual available in the US. Through corners, you get a near-perfect balance of playful rear-end rotation, but no loss of front-end grip, which in my opinion is the way it should be. Suspension tuning, even in dynamic mode, is pretty compliant, and it's a nice balance again of comfort and dynamics, I guess, as the name suggests. Unfortunately, there's no race mode in this 4-cylinder Giulia, which does mean, weirdly, that there's no way to turn off traction or stability control. I don't really get why they didn't do that, but I mean, the rear-wheel drive Giulia 4-cylinder doesn't really struggle for grip, so I don't know why you wouldn't be able to if you wanted to have a little bit more fun. To be honest, my only other real gripes come at the livability end of the spectrum, because while the Brembo brakes are once again excellent in dynamic situations, the pedal calibration is a little odd, because the first few millimeters feel like you're doing nothing, and then you get what feels like everything. So that does make it a little bit tricky to drive smoothly, or brake smoothly rather, in lower speed situations. Also, something I noticed is the turn signal and wiper stalks don't stick out past the paddle shifters. meaning if you're going to be turning or changing lanes, you actually have to reach around the shift paddle to put the blinker on, rather than just being able to go straight from the wheel like in most cars. Also, highway fuel economy, even in the 4-cylinder, is unfortunately on the lower end of the segment, but that's really about it. It's a really good driving car otherwise. On the outside, the Giulia TI Sport is also very similar to the Quadrifoglio, because save for, a rear spoiler, bigger side skirts, things like that, it is very much otherwise identical to the average person. Of course, the gorgeous body lines and proportions remain, which I think is a great thing. This is a beautiful car from any angle, but especially from this side profile. Even the wheel design is virtually identical to the Quadrifoglio, although of course the 4-cylinder version does get slightly narrower tires. I'm also a big fan of the spec of this particular car because it features the Nero Edition package, which pairs black trim with the metallic black paintwork and dark gunmetal silver alloy wheels. And of course, behind them you have red and white brake calipers to match the red interior. Hopping inside, the Giulia's cabin is just as stunning as the exterior, especially in the two-tone black and red of this car. The driver's main touch points, the steering wheel and gear shifter, are clad in a mixture of smooth and perforated leather. They're nice and chunky, and they have red stitching to match the seats. Speaking of the seats, the front seats, at least the driver's seat anyway, has power adjustable bolsters, and both seats have thigh cushion extenders, which feel very nice. And surprisingly, there's actually not really any Chrysler parts bin switchgear in here, which is more than you can say for most current Maserati products. There's also tons of fancy looking details in here, like the speaker grills on the doors that you probably can't see in this camera shot, or the sort of not quite carbon fiber but sort of dark aluminum trim throughout, as well as, again, these big silver shift paddles that I mentioned before. Still though, the entire interior has an underlying sense of traditional Italian craftsmanship, meaning that it feels like it's going to fall apart as soon as Napoleon comes anywhere near it. Perhaps that's also why the driving position is not super friendly for tall people, because I don't know if you can tell, I'm not that far back from the dash. I mean, this is a regular, I think, driving and steering wheel position, but the B-pillar is almost completely blocking me from the side. When I sit back and turn my head to the side, all I see is this B-pillar. The ergonomics of getting in and out, combined with these chunkier seat bolsters, can be a little bit tricky. Joking aside, interior quality in here is fine. It'll get you by, but honestly nothing more. It should probably be a little bit more premium for a car that was in the mid $50,000 range new, as should the technology, because for some reason, even though every other Fiat Chrysler product in the last decade has used essentially the same version of Chrysler's Uconnect infotainment system, Alfa Romeo decided to go their own route with theirs. And while it did get an update for 2020 with finally making this a touchscreen, because God forbid you have to use the little dial down here, which honestly works even better than the touchscreen in most scenarios, because this is pretty darn laggy. This system, it's better than it used to be, I can say that, but it's still incredibly complicated. You do have the ability to, see multiple things at once outside of using Apple CarPlay, which I always like to see, but for instance, it took me way too long earlier to figure out how to change the equalizer for the music. And honestly, I don't even know if I'm going to remember it again right now while I'm going to try to show you. I think you have to go in settings, which is reasonable enough. And then, some cars there would just be an audio menu right here. But you have to go into infotainment, not system as you might think, and then audio. And then there you go. Why can't I just get to that directly from my music menu? I get that, on one hand, this is one of those things you're probably going to set it once and then never change it again. But as someone who's gotten in and out of a lot of cars, on a regular basis, it is something that I tend to set up fairly regularly, right? And this was way too confusing. Another thing I'd like to point out, if I put it in reverse here, is due to the size of this screen, the backup camera display is incredibly small. I mean, it's hard to tell on camera maybe, but the actual display here is probably just about the same size as the GoPro that I'm holding, which is not very big. If you'd moved this screen over, you know, 1.5 inches, 2 inches maybe, you could get a whole nother inch of height here all the way across at least. I get that you want to maintain a traditional aspect ratio, but there is so much wasted space right here. At least you can see the parking sensors directly next to the camera, unlike in the earlier models as well. Something I'll never understand either. And in fairness, the feature content in here for the most part is pretty good. Again, the 2020 update that I mentioned before brought more available safety features, but unfortunately not standard. Although, with this being a TI Sport Premium package and Nero Edition, you do get things like heated front seats, heated rear seats, a heated steering wheel, the dual pane sunroof that you can see behind me there, as well as things like power folding mirrors, you know, automatic LED headlights with cornering action, you know, things like that. But at the same time, there are still a few things that you probably would expect on a car in the mid $50,000 range once again, like, I don't know, radar cruise control or blind spot monitoring. Ultimately, these things just go back to what I said before about this car having a driving experienced focused design above all else, because it's so good from behind the wheel that it's also simultaneously slightly flawed when you start to pull back a little bit. But to its credit, it is by far the most interesting, unique, and genuinely one of the best driving small sports sedans in its segment. Even with an extended warranty factored into the price, which I probably would err on the side of caution, just given Alfa Romeo's history, even once that's factored in, it's also a pretty darn good value proposition, because this car, like I said, stickered in the mid $50,000 range, but is now listed with just 12,000 miles on it for $27,000 and change. Yes, for the same price, you could get a Genesis 3.3 liter turbo, which would be a little bit faster and have maybe a few more tech features on the inside, but as it's always been said, you're never going to be a true petrol head until you've owned an Alfa Romeo. And it's also a darn good car outside of that. In the past, you know, owning an Alfa Romeo was both a rite of passage and, unfortunately, something you had to be a little bit ashamed of sometimes. But of course, time will tell, but it seems like this may not be the case in the latter anymore. Of course, as always, I want to extend a huge thank you to Echo Park Raleigh, and just throwing this out there, this is not influencing any of my opinions about this car either. You see the good and the bad. Again, time will tell. Here we are. I want to extend a huge thank you to Echo Park Raleigh for allowing me access to this Giulia, but also their entire inventory of competitively priced, high-quality pre-owned vehicles like this one. If this car is still available, you'll find it linked down below, but as always, you can browse echopark.com anytime. And if you enjoyed this video, give it a huge thumbs up. As always, thanks for watching, and consider subscribing for plenty more content to come.